Good evening and welcome to On the Line with Damien Lewis, who I'm delighted to say has returned. So I didn't put him off too much, or our questions didn't put him off too much. But before I start talking to Damien, I must, of course, thank our funders, the Armed Forces Covenant Fund Trust, who support On the Line, and without which we could definitely not do this. Damien, thank you so much for joining us again.
Great to be back. Thank you for having me.
So this is your fourth book in the series of SAS Great Escapes. It's out on Thursday, I believe.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. We have a launch in London at the Imperial War Museum at the Churchill War Rooms.
Oh, are there tickets still available for that, or have you?
I'm sorry, it's been fully booked for actually months now. It went very quickly. So, but there are other events happening. If people go to my social media, they'll find stuff.
Okay, so and it's usually Damien Lewis author, is it, Dave?
It's my website's damienlewis.com, but on Twitter I'm at author D Lewis, and on Facebook I'm Damien Lewis Writer. So any of those, you'll get to me and you'll see what's happening.
Perfect. So head to Damien's website because there's I'm sure if you can get to one of his talks, it'll be well worth it. Just remind our audience that if you do have a question, please put it in the Q&A at the bottom, and we will endeavour to get through as many of those questions as possible. And so, without further ado, I've never read any of your previous escape volumes, Damien, so apologies for that. But I have read the other trilogy of World War II and the SAS's exploits in World War II. But I was really, really struck with this about how much it's a far more emotional journey, and you don't just decide to break out and get back to your own lines without an awful lot of help from other people. And I'm just wondering the importance of those people and what kind of person is a successful escapee?
Yeah, so it's a curious thing about all these escape stories, really, from the SAS in World War II. You know, British soldiers in the Second World War were under an obligation to escape, should it be possible. And obviously, part of the reason for that was to get back to Allied lines and rejoin the fight. But the other part of it was to tie up as many of the enemy's armed forces as you could, because they'd be hunting you and trying to recapture you after you escaped. So that was, you could argue, two of the key reasons why people tended to try to, make these escapes. But in the SAS and other special forces, there was another factor at play, which played an absolutely central role. I think probably the most compelling role of all, and it was guilt. And it sounds a really strange thing to say, but when these individuals who've been generally used to repeated back-to-back operations deep behind enemy lines, facing death, injury, or capture at every turn, when those individuals ended up in a prisoner of war camp, they were, comparatively speaking, reasonably safe and okay. Yeah, the food wasn't very good, but there was enough to keep you alive. The conditions weren't particularly pleasant, but you could survive. But they knew at the same time that their fellows who they'd been serving with and grown so incredibly close to in a unit like the SAS, which you do, they become your absolute brothers in arms. Those relationships are irreplaceable. And when you were in that POW camp, you realize, you knew it was always like sitting on your shoulder, this voice telling you your mates are at this very moment somewhere deep in enemy territory, risking their lives to try and help win this war, and you're sat in this POW camp. So very often, the driving impetus was guilt, and to get back to your unit and to rejoin and stand firm with, your fellow warriors. I think that's something that actually most soldiers will relate to. And there's only one exception actually that stands out in this volume of Great Escapes. There's 5 stories told in it, five chapters. And it's the escape of John Verney, Captain John Verney, in Sardinia. Well, that's where he's captured in 43, just as the Operation Husky landings are about to go down in Italy. And Verney's captured, and he executes these repeated incredible escape attempts, but he's very, very clear from the get-go as to his reason for doing it. And it's actually to get back to the UK to see his wife and child, because he got married just before the war, conceived a son, after the marriage, and then had never seen his son because he'd been away fighting and soldiering with the SAS eventually. So for him, it was that compelling family reason, but that's an exception. Most of these individuals, and again, most of them, let's bear in mind how young they were, like, late teens, early 20s, almost to a man. So for most of them, the driving impetus was guilt and the need to get back and rejoin your unit and the fight. And in terms of the first part of your question, the kind of help from others along the way and the incredibly poignant and emotional relationships that these escapees forged with locals, it's a truism of special forces or guerrilla operations that, for them to be possible, you need one of two things to be extant. Either you need wide open spaces where nobody lives, like the North African desert, because you can attack the enemy, melt back into the desert, go to ground in the Great Sand Sea, and you're reasonably safe. There's no one to report on you. You either need that, or if the areas are populated, you need the support of the locals because they're the water within which you swim. They feed you, they shelter you, they succor you, they don't give you away to the enemy, and sometimes they fight on your side as well. It's exactly the same in these great escapes. There's not one example in the volume or even the volumes that come before where at certain junctures along the way, these individuals, despite all their amazing training, despite their mindset, despite their tenacity, despite their determination repeatedly to get out and get back to their comrades in arms, there's always a moment when they're going to have to fall upon the charity of the locals. And the most extraordinary thing is that certainly in Italy and France and even Yugoslavia, covered in this book, the charity of the locals is actually often extended without any, well, with little view to what will happen to them if they are captured helping an Allied escapee. Because, of course, in countries like Italy or France or Yugoslavia, if you were found helping an Allied escapee, very bad things would happen to you, your family, and very possibly your whole village.
Yeah, it's very easy to sort of undervalue the importance they played, isn't it, and the risks they were taking. But also, you know, when you're actually going to approach a local, it's about, you're taking a phenomenal risk as well, aren't you? Because of that threat, as you've already pointed out, there's a very high possibility that they may turn you into the authorities.
Absolutely, yeah. Of course, that's always a risk. I mean, generally speaking, this was true in Italy and also true in France. They tended to alight upon the isolated farmstead. They found the more rural the individual and actually the less wealth they had, generally the more amenable they were to just, doing the right thing and helping. And of course, it was often those kind of individuals who formed the backbone of the resistance in those countries. But bear in mind also that, certainly by, September, October 1943, we had an intimation, certainly, that Hitler's commando order existed, this legal order that he'd issued that, any Allied soldiers captured, whether, on the front line, behind the lines, fighting or trying to surrender, armed or unarmed, they would be kept alive only for long enough for the Gestapo and SS to torture them, interrogate them, and then shot out of hand, in other words, murdered. We had an intimation that that was the kind of fate these people might face were they captured, certainly if they fell into the hands of the SS and Gestapo. And so there was a strong argument that, you didn't actually really have much of a choice. You were damned if you did, and you were damned if you didn't.
Yeah. And these stories aren't just, I say just, escaping from a POW camp. They're also where operations don't necessarily pan out in quite the way it's expected. You think, well, the only way we can stay in the fight is get back. And I think the extent to which people try, and the individuals in the books try and continue their operation, even in the most minimal of ways, in terms of some of the things, the anecdotes that you're telling in the story. And I think, so it's not just getting back, is it? It's also almost at every step contributing.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the story I mentioned, John Verney's story, where he's a captain and he leads his patrol into Sardinia, the island off Italy's coast, and their mission was to raid German air bases so that those warplanes couldn't be used to sink the Allied invasion fleet, Operation Husky invasion fleet. And they go in a submarine, and three or four of the patrols are dropped before them. But when it comes time for them to be dropped, the submarine has a mechanical fault, so it can't drop them. So it has to return to base in North Africa. And that by the time they get back to base, it's like, just a few hours before 0 hour, where they're supposed to be in attacking the airfield. But Verney typically says, well, we'll just parachute in. So just imagine the logistics of that. You've got all your equipment, you know, packed in a way that you will do an infiltration overland to attack the target, having been dropped by a submarine. You've suddenly got to repack to get all that equipment into drop containers to be dropped from an aircraft, to choose a drop zone, which of course you've got no idea at all what you're looking at, and to somehow get everybody ready for a parachute jump in a matter of hours. That's exactly what they did. They flew in, parachuted out of the aircraft, were dropped pretty much in the right place, did an infiltration, the last few kilometers on foot, got to the airbase, lay up, observed it, and then went in and carried out their attack at night and blew up a load of warplanes. Even that in itself was an incredible feat of infiltration. But then the exfiltration, they had to literally cross pretty much the whole length of Sardinia to get to the pre-arranged rendezvous where there was an escape party waiting to get them out to rendezvous with a submarine that was going to pick them up. Little did they know, because they managed to affect nearly that, well, pretty much that whole traverse of Sardinia without getting captured. There are numerous close encounters along the way. Verney, very fortunately, happened to be pretty much a fluent German speaker. So whenever the Italians were trying to capture him, he was posing as a German soldier. Whenever the Germans were trying to capture him, he was an Italian soldier. Brilliant bluff and daring, which the SAS inculcated in the ranks at every level, But when they get pretty much to that rendezvous, they realize they've been betrayed, because right at the end of the mission, somebody pretty much foisted upon them an Italian-American translator. And that guy, whether he lost his nerve and went to the enemy, or whether he just was a traitor anyway, went to the enemy and betrayed every single one of the patrols. So all of them end up captured. And that's just the start of a series of escapes that follow.
And when he does that as well, they're parachuted in with basically just enough to carry out the mission. They weren't heavily armed at all, were they? They weren't easily able to defend themselves, but I think they only had sidearms, didn't they?
Yeah, it's very, very often the case. I mean, it's the first escapee in the book is Bridgman Evans and his patrol. And, again, it's an incredibly rushed mission. And when a mission is rushed, I'm sure a lot of the people listening to this will relate to this. When a mission's rushed, what you do is you just chuck all your kit in a container. That's all your weapons and everything, because you don't have time to rig yourself up properly and to plan it properly. So Bridgman Evans patrol, they were going into Sicily to do another similar kind of operation. And when they had just hours to deploy, and so everything was chucked in the drop containers, including all their main weapons. So all they had was sidearms, their Colt pistols and maybe a couple of grenades. So when they're actually dropped over Sicily, and they're dropped too high in the first place, so the enemy see them. But secondly, they realise that actually the light that signals you to parachute out goes from green to red. Sorry, from red to green. Obviously, they realised that had malfunctioned. And so the people actually in the aircraft who are going to kick out the drop containers after them, they don't realize they've even gone. So when the guy comes through from the cockpit to start getting them ready to jump and get the drop containers ready, they've already jumped out of the aircraft because the lights malfunctioned. So none of their containers are dropped to where they are. So they end up in the midst of Italian garrisoned Sicily, having been seen as they come down in the night because they've been dropped too high, and with just their pistols and no food and no escape gear. And of course, it's a recipe for getting captured and all that follows.
But they were captured by betrayal, really, weren't they? Not through any inadequacy in their own plan, or in their own attitude towards solving the problem. Even though they were lightly armed, that wasn't the fact that betrayed.
No,
Gave them
I mean, they were Bridgman Evans patrol were captured by the errors that beset their drop. I mean, it was plagued by errors from even before they got on the aircraft, with all the rushed nature of the deployment. And that goes back to the whole, kind of founding ethos of the SAS, and how high command. It took until D-Day before they really started to get their head around what the SAS were supposed to be used for. So the reason why Bridgman Evans patrol is so incredibly rushed is because this is a two SAS story. So it's Bill Sterling's two SAS, not David Sterling, the founder's one SAS. David Sterling has by now been captured, but Bill Sterling's raising number two SAS. And Bill Sterling argued that in Italy they should drop 300 odd 2 to 4 man patrols deep behind the enemy lines and just completely paralyze the whole rail network across northern Italy, because that would stop the Germans sending their reinforcements to the south when they knew where the Husky landings were going to take place. And it's a brilliant idea. And it would have paid untold dividends. It would have ended up in a lot of the guys getting killed, captured, or injured, or worse. But it would have done what it said on the tin. The high command refused to use them in that way, and so these deployments are piecemeal, scattered, and last minute.
Mm. And obviously, Italy, or the boot, as it were, is a very, very long peninsula. So it's, it would be relatively easy to cut that off as well. It's not like they're in the middle of
No,
in the middle of a
absolutely.
continent. So it's.
Yeah.
I'm not a military man, but that does sound like a sensible plan
No,
to.
I mean, it was a genius plan, and one of the missions that one of the few missions he did get greenlit, which was Operation Speedwell. Those patrols dropped in and they blew up any number of Italian railroads, but also the trains upon them. And they deliberately targeted the trains in tunnels. So when the trains were going into the tunnel, you blew them up. And of course, it's very, very hard to clear that kind of wreckage inside a tunnel. Hugely successful, just too few of them. So Bill Sterling was proven right. He was a visionary without a doubt, but high command just wouldn't use them in that way. In Italy, they used most of them as just shock troops, tip of the spear, up the cliffs you go, clear the way.
Mm.
Wasn't how the SAS was designed to be used at all.
What would you describe the differences between Bill and David Sterling in terms of how that manifested in their operations and how they planned operations? So how were they different?
Bill Sterling was far more of a level-headed pragmatist. That's not to say he wasn't a visionary, he absolutely was, but he wasn't the showman like David Sterling. You needed a David Sterling, you could argue, to start the SAS because it required a showman to go and sell it to high command. Okay. And
Mhm.
David Sterling did a magnificent job of doing that. And he also did a magnificent job, of course, of fighting the battle in the corridors of power to keep the SAS alive. Bill Sterling was much more a kind of level-headed military man with a genius for these kind of operations. And to give you another, kind of demonstration of the difference between Bill and David. David went on numerous frontline operations. He was very often in the field, and he had that, you could argue, healthy or maybe unhealthy, depends how you look at it, that competition with Blair Paddy Mayne to see who could blow up as many German aircraft as possible. Of course, Paddy Mayne was always going to win because Paddy Mayne was the frontline raider par excellence. Bill Sterling never went on an operation. So from the moment he founded 2SAS right the way through to preparing for the D-Day operations, where he had to fall on his sword because once again, Allied High Command were trying to use the SAS in the most ridiculous of ways, to use them as a blocking group ahead of the Normandy, drop them in the hours before Normandy landings, a few kilometres in from the beaches to try and hold back the mass ranks of German armour. How they were going to do that, dropping in with the light weapons they would have had, was anyone's guess. That's how they were supposed to be used. And Bill Sterling had to fall on his sword to stop that happening. So that was his tenure in command of 2SAS at an end. And Brian Franks took over. Very capable leaders, it has to be said. But so Bill Sterling, you know, he would do whatever it took to get the job done. Because you can imagine the sacrifice it takes not to deploy for all of that time, especially when you know the kind of things that are happening to the men you send into the field.
Mm.
You're getting reports back, and many of them were not returned. Got a lot of admiration for him.
What did he do post-war?
He went back to running the family estate in Scotland, and then became a businessman basically. You
Mm.
know, yeah, but of course he was right there at the start of special operations, right there at the very beginning. With the Scottish training schools, right from the very get-go, and actually before two SAS were formed. It's really fascinating because I mean, I wasn't really aware of this, but um, the the team of raiders who feature in the Ministry of Ungentle Warfare, the Guy Ritchie movie, and the book I wrote with the same name, the small scale raiding force, which then became 6-2 Commando, which had the remit to carry out the cross channel raids very early in the war, right? They were disbanded kind of like spring 1943 because that kind of soldiering cross channel raids was over. And Bill Sterling was in command of small scale raiding force stroke 6-2 Commando at that time. He'd taken over command. So what he did to form 2SAS was he took most of those individuals from 6-2 Commando, flew them to North Africa, and that's how he set up the SAS training base in Philippeville to start forming this unit. they were the core of seasoned recruits that kind of, enabled SAS to cut its eye teeth.
Mm. So it's their difference in personalities there that's kind of manifesting in what we know about them in popular culture, if that's the right phrase, isn't it? I mean, it's all about David Sterling, isn't it, in terms of as a fan of an SAS, but there's clearly much more to that. I thought as well in the stories as well, I was actually really quite taken aback by the sort of sadness in some of these stories that the individuals felt for some of the people they met, not people they were serving with necessarily, but people they met. Do you want to just talk about those a little bit? Because I was quite taken aback by some of those.
Yeah, there's a poignancy to some of these missions, and obviously, I was a war reporter for 2 decades, and it's something I relate to very closely. If you spend a lot of time embedded within a civilian population in a war zone, you get very close to them. It's just the nature of the beast. It's same with soldiers. If you're there, especially if you're trying to defend that population or their town or their village, or in my case, reporting on that experience, you forge these very, very close relationships. And in these escape stories, of course, that's exactly what they're doing. They're embedding themselves with the local population at times as they're on that escape journey. And in one of the stories in particular, Lewis Archie Gibson's story, which is a really exceptional chapter in the volume. Gibson, who was originally Long Range Desert Group, so the forerunners to the SAS, the Desert Reconnaissance Specialists, who then teamed up with the SAS at the start of the SAS's operations. So Gibson was an LRDG driver, and he had all the LRDG vehicles had a name on them, and he had named his WWII, WHADAUR, Who Dares. And when David Sterling saw that, because obviously SS motto is Who Dares Wins, he was like, I need that vehicle and I need that guy as my driver. So Gibson became David Sterling's driver of choice. And there's a fabulous moment in the book where they're returning from the raid on Burat Harbour, where they went there to sink German shipping and blow up fuel tankers. And there's a roadblock up ahead, and David, and obviously heavily armed, and know they're coming. And David Sterling orders Gibson to leave the road to go around the roadblock. Gibson realizes this is all taking place in the blink of an eyelid, and Gibson realizes the road's raised up above the desert, and if he goes off the road at speed they're traveling, they'll roll the vehicle and they'll all, either be killed or captured. So he disobeyed Sterling's orders, drives straight for the roadblock. They all open fire, guns blazing, and somehow they managed to bust their way through. And as a measure of David Sterling, okay, remember, SAS founders a meritocracy. Merit above rank was what mattered. And David Sterling, after that, realizing how Gibson's split-second decision had pretty much saved all their lives, he puts him forward for a military medal, despite the fact he disobeyed his orders. Anyway, Gibson goes on eventually to take his patrol into Yugoslavia, which is fascinating because I've never written about Yugoslavia and knew almost nothing about it in terms of the war, and certainly knew very little about the fact that we had special operations units there. It's incredible. Anyway, goes to Yugoslavia, and they're embedded with the Yugoslav partisans, and they're there for weeks and weeks on end, getting hunted by the Germans, hunted by the Ustaše, who were the Yugoslav fascists. And it's brutal, and it's bloody, and it's intense firefights, and villages getting destroyed. And at some stage fairly early on, Gibson is allocated a translator, and the translator happens to be a beautiful young Yugoslav lady named Zara, and very quickly they fall in love. So imagine that affair, that relationship in the middle of the Yugoslav mountains, under all that stress and tension, never knowing if you're both going to be alive from one hour to the next. So this is obviously it's a full-blooded and intense relationship. Then eventually Gibson, what they're actually doing there mainly is they're there to call in airstrikes. That's their main They do lots of other things, but their chief role is to call in airstrikes via their radio. Very successful. The Germans realize what they're doing. That's why they're hunting them so intensively, because obviously, a small unit that can call in airstrikes is a massive force multiplier. And that's what the Germans realize, because they're getting hit left, right, and center. But eventually their radio goes kaput. It stops working. So in a sense, there's no point in them being there anymore. And Gibson says, we need to leave, go get a fresh radio, and then we'll be back. So they execute this incredible escape, get to the port, Gibson's there with Zara, and she's like, in tears, and he's like, what are you worried? She said, I'll never see you again. Of course, you'll see me again. I'll be back in the blink of an eyelid. In fact, he uses the phrase "shake of a lamb's tail," which she loves. It makes her laugh. He gets on the ship with his men. He's pretty downcast, as you can imagine. Those who've been trying to hide it. Gets back to Italy, and the whole situation changes. Mark Tito, who's the chief of the left-leaning partisans, realizes the way the world's going, and that he needs to ally himself, in his view, with Russia. So Britain and America and our allies are no longer welcome. And so Gibson's desperately trying to get back to his mission, but also to get back to Zara, and he never can. So it's a really, really poignant, you know, yeah, uh, very poignant end to the story. And it's something that, I'm sure Gibson found it very hard to come back from that, because quite near the end of the war by now.
Yeah, and it gives a level of humanity to it in a way that, I mean, obviously we see all this sort of thing in films and all the rest of it, but it's rare, in my experience, that you come across that in actual combat. I will read it in a book. That's actually a story that's been captured.
Sure. I mean, the great thing about Gibson's story as well, and huge, heartfelt shout out to Gibson's family. The way the story came to me, it's remarkable. About 3 years ago, somebody emailed me via my website, right? Email drops into my inbox, and I open it and I read it. It's from Paul Gibson, Archie Gibson's son. And he said, I'm Paul Gibson. My father was in LRDG, was with David Sterling in the war. He wrote his life story. It's never been published. Would you like to read it? So, of course, I said, yes. He sent it to me. Boy, 500 pages of just absolute amazing brilliance, and then he sent me this. He wrote it twice, so he sent me the second manuscript, and again, just utterly fantastic. And then he sent me all of his war diaries and memorabilia. And the war diaries aren't just diaries of, like, really detailed entries of, fighting in the desert, for example, but he was a brilliant poet. So there's this really moving poetry. There's a poem in the book, actually, but he's also a brilliant artist, and he sketches these scenes of combat. That's gold dust. That because these people aren't alive anymore, sadly. That's the kind of material you need to really bring a story alive. And as you say, in Gibson's own account, he writes absolutely poignantly and from the heart about his relationship with Zara. And you wouldn't normally get that kind of material. You certainly don't get that through dry military reports.
Mm. So what's it feel like, Damien, when, a family member contacts you and says, I've got a bit of a story here that you might be interested in? And what impact, how do you feel about that? I guess that people are trusting you, because it's obviously, this is family stuff. It's important, right?
Yeah, I'll tell you a story that will answer that question, because it's the most remarkable story. It's probably the most remarkable story of my authorial career. So about, where are we now? March, February, maybe this year. Again, an email drops into my inbox from a young lady called Jo Hussey, and she says, my granddad served in the SAS in World War II, and he wrote his life story. Would you like to read it? And I thought, yeah, that's great. Where are you based? She said, well, my parents live in Bournemouth, and that's not so far from me. So I said, oh, that's just around the corner, really. I can pop over. Kind of forgot about it. I was in the middle of writing my next book, which comes out in October this year. Okay, I got to 85,000 words, so pretty much the book written. And I thought, okay, let's take a break. Let's go and see the Hussey family. So, called them up, jumped in my car, drove over there, met Jo and her mum and her father, welcome me in, tea, cakes, and all this memorabilia, including the manuscript on the desk. And eventually I said, so, I don't even know what your father's name was. Could you tell me? She said it was George Arnold. And I felt the hairs on the back of my neck go up. I said, what did you say? She said, George Arnold. She said, no one's ever heard of him. He's never mentioned in any book. He's never been mentioned in any program. I don't really even know what he's written in his book is true or not, because how can I verify it? I said, I tell you how you can verify it. I've just written an 85,000 word book about your father. And she just couldn't believe it. And I said, not only that, I said, because Arnold was deployed in Italy as an SAS unit, but co-located with a unit of the OSS, the Office for Strategic Services, the American equivalent of the SOE, right? So the OSS kept rigorous records, and I'd got them all from the American archives. So I said to Claire Hussey, that that his daughter, I said, not only have I written an 85,000 word manuscript, which I will share with you, but I have all the files from the American archives, which will verify every single thing that's in that book. And I could tell her stuff about the people that she was there with, which she just didn't know about, or certainly didn't know if they were true. Well, you can imagine the emotion of that.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, it was, yeah, she was absolutely beside herself. I mean, very tearful, it's very, very emotional because she'd spent her life wondering how much of what Dad's written is true. You know, she'd never really been able to talk to him about it. And often, let's be frank about it, these guys wrote these things never to be published and maybe never even to be read by the family. They wrote it for therapy because it's such a good way of dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder, as we now know. Writing stuff down is one of the therapy means. So, for her and her granddaughter to suddenly meet this author out of the blue who says, I've just finished writing a book about your father. And I can tell you, so when I got home, I sent by WeTransfer all the files of my research. So she could then just sit down and go, my God, that's him. These are the people he was there with. Yeah. So these are very special moments.
So you said you'd written 85,000 words and then you thought, I'd take a break, I'll go and see this family. Did this involve any major rewrite, or what then happened for you?
Yeah, it did. It ended up being 120,000 words. So there you go. I mean, I wasn't finished at 85,000 words, but her father's account was so rich and so honest as well. So really, really brutally honest. I mean, absolutely. They end up, he ends up spending 6 months behind the lines in Italy. He's given up for dead, as are most of his patrol. They got no resupply. So the way they managed to fund and rearm and their operations is by Robin Hood operations. They're literally robbing the worst fascists in the area. And sometimes they're executing them because they are really nasty people. And it's just brutally honest the whole way through. You just don't get that kind of material very often, if at all.
So when you get because you're right, a lot of people do want to put pen to paper, don't they, to talk about what they've done, and quite often late in life, I think it's fair to say, because it's obviously sometimes now or never. Um, so you get a manuscript. I mean, obviously, it doesn't necessarily mean to say that that could be published, but do you feel like some sort of duty almost to publish it, or do you think the way you're approaching it to incorporate? I mean, this is chance that you're talking about here, that you'd already written that story, but when you get given a manuscript that you haven't written a whole story about, does that change your ideas? Do you think actually there's something here that I need to explore? Because obviously, I mean, clearly from what you've just said, getting the American records, and you talk about this in your book as well. You give quite a lot of praise to places like Kew and the National Records Office and the importance of keeping these and digitizing these records. So the amount of work that goes into doing this is, I dare say, absolutely phenomenal. I think I have no comprehension, but I can get a real sense of that. And I think that's really important, isn't it? Do you find then when people contact you, it changes your ideas, your direction? Think I actually need to explore this more.
Well, certainly in the case of George Arnold's story, you know, yeah, I'm really keen to see it published properly. You couldn't publish it in the form it's in at the moment.
Mm.
The diction needs improving and the grammar and it needs some context and stuff. But yeah, because we've lost all of our veterans from the SAS, as far as I'm aware, from World War II. And we are losing all of our World War veterans so quickly now. These kind of stories, these testimonies, which were written, during their lifetimes and written with real passion and honesty, are gems. And I actually do think, yeah, they need to be that they need to be put out there and published in a way that we can read them and enjoy them, but also in a way which we can commemorate and remember. So yeah, that's something I've got actually at the forefront of my mind, the need to do this with that story, with Gibson's story as well. And there's one other that I've been sent recently that I thought, gosh, yes, this needs to be published. So yeah.
Plenty of work for you still to do there, Damien, I suspect. So we're getting some questions coming in, so we'll have a look at one or two of those. But just a reminder to everybody, if you do have a question, please pop it in the Q&A. I can see some in the chat as well. It matters not. I can read them all. Rob asks, how often does Damien get approached by family with "my grandfather was in the SAS"? but it's a false claim?
That's a good question. I can think of, can I think of any examples at all? I can't think of a single example where that's happened, but maybe that's because I filter them out very early on if I think there's anything which doesn't add up. Um, but I've never come across an example where, for example, I've gone and met someone or seriously engaged with someone and it hasn't been genuine. I mean, these people have a reason to want to do this, and the reason it always is simply because they want their family member story told, and they want them to be remembered and commemorated.
But it's what you said there, isn't it, as well? It's also about, because obviously these stories, if you just read a manuscript that Grandad wrote, I mean, it would read like fiction to the uninitiated, wouldn't
Yeah.
it? And I think
Mm.
so that you talked about validating this story or words to that effect.
Yeah.
And I think that's also equally important, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, for example, I'll give you an example with Archie Gibson's story, Yugoslavia, because I've read so little about Yugoslavia, and to be honest with you, I didn't know that we had elite forces operations going on there. Really. I knew SOE were there, but I didn't know these kind of units were there. So, I thought, well, I need to verify this. So I sent a message to my specialist researcher, who's thanked in the book, who used to work in the Q archives for decades and knows it inside out, and said, Simon, look, any chance you can check for me about this unit in Yugoslavia during these periods? There's probably nothing, but can you just check? He found the war diary. And the war diary is so detailed that every single place that's mentioned and pretty much every single operation is recorded in the war diary. So it's, there's instant corroboration because the war diary is written contemporaneously at the time. And likewise with Arnold's story in Italy, getting those files from the OSS was, a eureka moment because they had kept really, really detailed records, whereas the SAS hadn't. So once again, there's instant corroboration, and you read it from several different sources, and that's how I could meet his daughter and say that guy was there at that time. I've got an OSS file to prove it.
Gosh, I can only imagine what her reaction must have been.
Yeah, no, it's extraordinary.
Dave asks, what do you consider better leadership? From the front, inspiring and leading the troops with all the risks, or back at HQ, directing, organizing, and gaining experience?
Well, of course, both are necessary, but I think, the concept of transformational command, which is, the first style of leadership, which you mentioned, is for me the more compelling. The easiest way to answer that question is to talk about a guy I interviewed about 2 years ago. He's now sadly passed away, called Alec Boy Borry, who was nicknamed Boy because he was lied about his age to sign up and was still in his teens when Paddy Mayne interviewed him for the SAS and brought him into the SAS. And by the way, when Paddy Mayne interviewed him, he said words to the effect, how do you feel about killing? Because he could see how young the guy was. He literally looked like a Boy Scout. And Alec Borry said words to the effect, well, I haven't done any yet, but I think it'll be okay. And because of his disarming honesty, Paddy Mayne said, yeah, we'll have you. And he got through selection and then he deployed into France with the SAS. Anyway, I interviewed him about 2 years ago. And he said to me about Paddy Mayne, who was his commander, obviously, he said, we would have followed that man into hell. And you need to understand why. We would have followed him into hell, one, because he never asked anyone to do something he wouldn't do himself. He would lead from the front by example, always. And that was so utterly inspiring, you would follow him anywhere. Secondly, he would never order you to do anything, because in the SS it wasn't like that. Massive figure, he'd come and put his arm around you in that very kind of gentle Ulster brogue. He'd say, would you ever mind, Alec, going for 3 months behind enemy lines with no chance of coming back on a suicide mission? And because of who he was and you knew he'd be leading you, you would follow. He said the third thing was, we knew how much he cared for those men under his command. And we knew that every single loss hit him so personally, deeply in his heart. And that care that he had for us meant that we would follow him anywhere. And fourthly, he said we knew what an incredible battle instinct he had. No one else had anything like it. A marvelous battle nostril, which meant we knew if anyone had the chance of taking us into hell, and bringing us out again, it was Paddy Mayne. Now, that's a pretty good summation, in my view, of what a frontline commander should be like.
Mm. That's also, there are similar strands in the book, isn't there, about that, the senior officer in the escape team, if you want to call it that, being concerned about, there are times when they have to split up and they, may have to go on their own to cross lines, but there's always that constantly. It's a theme throughout the book about caring for your men, almost regardless of what rank, social background, whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a founding ethos of the SAS, and that's one of the reasons why they were so unpopular, of course, because it was not the done thing. You were not on first name terms. You didn't value the views of the lowliest rank, which of course the SAS did. They said, whatever your rank, whatever your social background, whatever your level of education, whatever you were doing before the war, whatever your class, we don't give a shit. What we care about is what you can bring to the table. Your ideas are as valid as anyone else, and perhaps more valid because you will have the ability to come up with ideas that we, who are the officer class, by default won't think of. And so it went two ways. It didn't just mean that you got this brilliant alchemy of thinking the unthinkable, thinking of ways to attack the enemy, which were just inconceivable. And then they may be inconceivable, but that's exactly what we're going to do because the enemy will never think that's how we're going to attack them by default. But not only that, imagine what the effect that had on the men themselves. They were empowered, they were valued, they knew exactly what they were there and fighting for. To the extent people have a misapprehension or tend to about the SAS, particularly in World War II, and maybe as a result of SAS Rogue Heroes, the BBC show, that they're all completely ill-disciplined. Utter rot. You have to understand that it's this alchemy of allowing every member of the patrol to be who he can be. Yeah. So giving them that self-confidence and space to prosecute the mission if they are the only man left alive, but at the same time married with iron discipline. You needed iron discipline. And the discipline was just very, very simple. It was self-discipline. That's why there was never any shouting or particular punishment regimes. It was very, very simple. It was self-discipline. And if you stepped out of line and broke the rules, you were returned to your unit. And can you imagine that any man who joined that exalted brotherhood wanted to be returned to their unit, to go back to the regular soldiering that they'd done before? No one wanted that. So the self-discipline was rigid.
Now you've mentioned SAS Rogue Heroes, so I'm going to have to follow up on that. Yes, it's a piece of fiction based on facts and what have you, and I think I was able to suspend my disbelief with the first season, but the second, I don't know. What are your thoughts on the series?
So I have two takes on the series. The first is that I'm glad that the story of these men in World War II and women has been brought to a wider audience, a younger audience, and it's done great to keep the history alive. Many things in it they're not just deeply inaccurate, but they're unnecessarily so. And I particularly take umbrage at the portrayal of Paddy Mayne.
Mm.
So Paddy Mayne never swore. Do you think he ever had to shout at his men to get them to carry out orders or listen to him? Do you think he was a psychopath, an unfeeling, unsympathetic psychopath to the degree he's portrayed in the BBC series? Do you think his men would have followed him into the jaws of hell and back again? No. So all those, this was a man who carried a book of poetry, a poetry anthology with him into battle. This was an individual who could relate to anyone, no matter their background, their class, and their breeding, as long as they would take the fight to the enemy. He's so much more of an interesting, fascinating, compelling, brilliantly Hollywood-esque character. So much better than the way they portrayed him. So
Mm.
much better. So it was unnecessary. So I'm ambivalent about the series. On the one hand, yes, it's got the story out there and a lot more people know about it. On the other hand, things were, it was Peaky Blinded in a way that was not necessary. And that portrayal of how those individuals are is very inaccurate. The ill discipline, the swearing, the lack of respect for rank leaders, whatever it was, that none of that holds true. And it just isn't convincing. To me, it's not, and I think to a lot of other, what it just isn't convincing that that kind of outfit would have achieved the things the SAS did in World War II, because they wouldn't have done if they were really like that.
Mhm. I think you're right. I think when you say about Paddy Mayne being a more interesting, complex, nuanced, I mean, there are plenty of superlatives we could use there, I think, but I think that seems to be they've missed the most important part of the whole story. It's more like a comic than it is
Yeah.
a history program. What I've felt anyway, and I don't sit with your level of expertise on the subject by any stretch of the imagination. So we have a couple more here. Questions. Darren, hello, Darren. My great uncle's unit, 367 Pegasus Squadron, used to do special missions in the Adriatic, northern Italy, Yugoslavia, Albania, and Greece, inserting and extracting agents. One downed airmen, supply drops, and VIPs, including Tito, Randolph Churchill, Evelyn Waugh, plus the Russians and partisans. So maybe there might be a bit more. If Darren's got more information there, head to Damien's website, I suspect.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. That's really, really interesting. I know there were units doing that, but correct me if I'm wrong, Darren, there's so little written about this. Where are the books? Where are the histories? I'm not aware of them.
Darren, I would definitely, if you've got more, I think it'd be definitely worth contacting Damien if you've got some more that would be worth sharing, because I know you're very passionate about telling your family story, because we've talked about this before. So thank you for that. Peter asks, thank you, Damien, for continuing to tell folk about the real Blair Main, not the twisted portrayal that some have chosen to make up. Hang on, sorry. We, the keepers, fully appreciate that. Peter Forbes, I think you may
Yeah, well
know
done, Peter.
him.
Thank you. Appreciate your efforts as well.
So the Victoria Cross, because that features, the story features in your previous book, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
And I know you've been quite open about your belief that it should be awarded posthumously.
Yeah.
What do you think what is your take on the story behind all of that?
Do you mean the action
Well, the reason
I
why,
mean,
because it was written as a VC, wasn't it? He was
yeah,
written up for it, and then it was crossed out, and then
yeah.
obviously nothing has happened really until well, to be fair, SAS wrote in the public consciousness until the TV program did come along. So just in a short way, what's your take on that story? Because obviously it goes over decades.
Yeah, well, there have been previous campaigns to get Paddy Mayne the VC. And of course, BBC Rogue Heroes has helped the present one. It goes back to what I was saying. It's raised the awareness, which is a good thing. But the documents that we've managed to unearth from the archives prove pretty much conclusively that was a clerical error. So basically, the Victoria Cross rules, or whatever you want to call it, say that the act should be a signal act of valor, SIGNAL, in other words, an outstanding act of valor. And one of those administering the VC recommendation for Paddy Mayne misread or misinterpreted that and saw it as being requiring a single, i.e., lone act of valor, which is obviously impossible because, look at all the VCs given out for Rorke's Drift. I mean, obviously, in most of these kinds of operations, you're not operating alone. Of course, in the operation in Nazi Germany in April 45, for which Paddy Mayne was put forward for the Victoria Cross, he was in a Jeep, but he had a rear gunner with him, a Lieutenant Scott. So there were two of them carrying out this incredibly brave operation. But the fact he wasn't on his own, it wasn't a single act of valor, is irrelevant. The VC rules say it has to be a signal act of valor, and by anyone's reckoning, it was. So, the case we're making at this very moment to the Honours Committee, and with the enormous help of Al Cairns, who's the Veterans Minister, is that this is an error of interpretation, and therefore this is a special case in which they should reassess and right the wrong. And I really hope that we will get it over the line because, look, actually, it's not, the way I view it. Yeah, of course, it would be wonderful to get, Blair Paddy Mayne awarded the Victoria Cross, but also bear in mind that no member of the British SAS has ever won a Victoria Cross. It's never been given out. Now, bear in mind the nature of their missions. Isn't that surprising? I do find that extremely surprising, as do other people. So in my view, it's also campaigning for a Victoria Cross for the SAS as a whole.
Mm.
And at this moment in time, when we are very possibly calling upon our armed services to go into harm's way in Europe, I suppose a possible peacekeeping force or whatever we want to call it in Ukraine, anything we can do to underline how we appreciate our armed services and how we appreciate their sacrifice and how honor will be properly rewarded. Anything we can do to to shout that from the rooftops is a good thing. And I see, the Paddy Mayne VC campaign as being part and parcel of that.
Do you think we're as a country less good? That's not a very good phrase. Not as good at recognizing the service of recent conflicts as well, because I think that's
I certainly think we've taken our eye off the ball with Iraq and Afghanistan. So, you know, it seems as if we've almost tried to bury them,
mm,
and I can only imagine what that is like for the veterans of those conflicts. Obviously, I've written about them a lot, but I wasn't there serving on the front line. I didn't have, my closest friends killed and injured and captured or whatever it might be. So, for those who have served in those conflicts to not be commemorated and remembered to the degree that they should be, in my view, must be soul destroying. So yeah, I do think um, I think there's a reckoning coming. I think we have for too long taken our armed forces for granted, run down our armed forces, and they suddenly, because of what's happening in Ukraine and with Russia, we've realised how very much we still need them, and we're reaping the whirlwind. This is long overdue. It's long overdue. There was a correction on all those fronts.
mm. I'm inclined to agree with you, Damon. Have to be honest. Rob says COP was active in Yugoslavia, operating with Viz and with Fleet Force Artillery Land Dubrovnik.
Gosh, there you go. Thank you for sharing that.
So again, if you have more information, Rob, I'm sure you could send an email via Damien's website.
Do send over, and if anybody knows of any reading material as well, because I'm fascinated now by the whole theatre. I'd like to read more on it.
Okay, Dan also says, you're right there, I will, in terms of having more information. Got the unit's air docs. Guy Walters is doing a book on Operation Windhorn 3 out next year, I believe, about capturing V2 parts, photos, plans from the AK army in Poland, and their bases in Italy. I have to say, that doesn't mean too much to me. It may mean a lot more to you.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, Wildhorn 3. Yeah, absolutely.
So we don't have long left, Damien. What do you work? You've told about this book that you had to rewrite because you got some more info hot off the presses.
Mhm.
Is this the end of SAS Great Escapes?
No, I'm working on a new volume right now, Great Escapes 5. And there are 3 families helping me with, the manuscripts their father wrote at the time, and loads of other archive and unique family material. So it's going to be a absolute cracker of a volume, and I'm really excited about it. It's kind of the gift that keeps giving. It's almost as like the more you write, the more people come out of the woodwork and say, read my father or grandfather's story. And I'm so grateful to those people, that without their stepping forward, it would be very hard to do the kind of work that I do. So, immense gratitude and respect.
Well, it wouldn't be possible without them, would it? And I think
No.
also from your perspective, the amount of time and effort and years you've put into this, and then to be discovering almost a new theatre of operations where British Special Forces. So there's quite clearly an awful lot probably still out there we've yet to hear about.
Yeah, that's one of the things that you realize actually. The more you dig, the more you find. The book that I've got coming out in October, ends up with, the SAS, these patrols being embedded with the operations Office of Strategic Services, the US American equivalent of our Special Operations Executive. So they end up, in these kind of dual missions behind enemy lines in Italy for many months on end. I mean, I just knew nothing about it, absolutely nothing about it at all. Stumbled upon the story. It's utterly remarkable, and it's never been written about before. No one's ever written anything about it, And some of these missions were quite extraordinary, the length of time they spent behind the lines, the lengths they went to do to survive, and the blows they struck against the enemy, absolutely extraordinary. And, giving
What
up dead.
What led you to OSS Records then? Because obviously, you know, that's obviously an American source. So, I mean, there must have been something that prompted that.
Yeah, I mean, there would have been a record, in the British archives saying, we parachuted in and there were 8 in our patrol. One of them was Nikolic, from the OSS. It'd just be something like that.
Right.
And I go, what do you mean the OS? Why would you be going in with the OSS? All right. So then I contact my American expert researcher and say, Sim, can you check if there's anything to this? And she goes, yeah, there's a load, massive files. How many do you want? So she dug them all out for me. So yeah, you just follow the kind of, small mentions like that, and suddenly you've got a bonanza of really rich material.
So then delving into the OSS, you'll probably find more archives. You'll find more breadcrumbs that will take you off on another journey.
Yeah, yeah. Generally, that's exactly what happens. Yeah, yeah.
Cool. Thank you. Grant says, great storytelling. Thank you.
Thank you, Grant.
Eric says, many thanks for an interesting session.
Thank you very much.
And I think I may have read that. Yes, I have. So that just remains for me to say to you, Damien, thank you so much for agreeing to this. I know you're a very, very busy man, and we put these things months in advance, and then things get in the way and we have to rejiggle a little bit. But as always, I would love to have you back on board when you do that. In fact, I insist upon it because I want to know, I want a reason for reading that book and asking you some questions, please.
Good man, good man. Looking forward to it. And it's a cracking story, so you won't be disappointed.
Yeah, and Darren says, he says thank you as well, and he will be in touch, so you can look
That's
forward
great.
to
Thank you,
landing
Dan.
in
I
your
look forward to it.